It's so much fun to see the network start to form, and that's some of the most fun that we've had in the past couple of years. We've been doing this is getting to talk to authors, creators, fans across the board. It's the people that we've gotten to meet and talk to that have been the most rewarding thing by far in doing all of this.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to episode 33 of SFF Addicts, where we'll be looking back on this past year, delving into our favorite reads of 2022. And joining me today are the powerhouse podcasting duo of Dylan Marsh and Charles MC, co-hosts of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. It's great to be here with you, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Doing great. A little nervous now about living up to the powerhouse moniker that you gave us there. But we're super excited to be here.
Yeah, man.
Absolutely.
We could change it the mediocre podcasting too.
That's more appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, we could live up to that standard for sure.
Just setting high expectations, man. Yeah. Just to start off, Dylan and Charles, would you mind letting folks know a little bit more about yourselves? You know, how'd you get into reading sci-fi and fantasy as well as podcasting? So Dylan, I'll toss it to you first.
Oh, yeah. And I got into reading it. You know, I did some reading of like the child fantasy books as a kid. Like I remember Phantom Tollbooth is a big one that I really liked as a kid. And then I would say, you know, I kind of, I don't know if I moved away from it, but just reading wasn't always the like top thing that I was focused on for a while. And then I really got back into it when the Game of Thrones show came out. And I was like, oh my God, I really love fantasy. This is really cool. So then I went straight to those books, but then I was like, I got to start reading some other stuff too. So I got to give a shout out then to our buddy, Robert V.S. Reddick, we did a read along with on our podcast a little while back, because I grabbed the Chathrin Voyage next, which is an awesome quartet, epic fantasy. I was like, oh, wow, I'm not just a Game of Thrones fan. I'm like a fantasy fan. I like all this other stuff. So yeah, from there, I've just been constantly reading, you know, some sci-fi, but really mostly fantasy. And it's only been bolstered by getting to do it alongside my lifelong friend, Charles.
Wow. Well, thanks, Dylan. I'll pick up that segue there. Like, my name's Charles. Nice to meet everybody. Adrian, thanks for having us on. Yeah, super happy to be here and talk some fantasy with you guys. Yeah, I've been an avid reader my whole life. You know, and science fiction and fantasy have been the two genres I've gravitated towards since the beginning. You know, I remember reading like The Giver by Lois Rowley in school, and then I read Del Toro Quest, which is a popular young child fantasy series. Harry Potter, at being at all the book launches and waiting in line to get your book signed. I actually did get some books signed by JK back in the day. Waited in a very long line in Huntington where Dylan and I grew up to get those signed. But and then chasing that ever since, like Dylan said. Game of Thrones, the show, was a big moment for us, because that's when we were both like, we've been friends for a long time, but we both like this too. Like, that's cool. And then we both kind of encouraged each other to read more, and then we started talking about it more and more, and that was kind of a unique thing to our friendship. And it's like, we're reading these books and we're talking about them, and we wish there was just more content out there like that. Why don't we, it's the pandemic, we're not going anywhere. Why don't we just, if we're going to have these conversations, why don't we just record them? And thus Friends Talking Fantasy was born. And now we're here, which is fantastic. So love fantasy and love the journey it's taken us on.
Dude, that's beautiful. Dylan, how long you guys been doing the podcast for?
Oh, geez. I mean, I guess we started in like late spring of 2020. Is that right, Charles? Like May 2020?
Yeah. So, it was like peak. It was, it felt like anyway, peak, shutdown 2020 pandemic situation was when we started. And we were doing a lot of weekly uploads. We were to 3 episodes a week at one point. Then we went on the long hiatus. But then a few months ago, we came back. So we're back to doing weekly episodes, and we're loving it.
Dude, 3 is insane.
It is.
It was out of control.
I don't know what we were thinking, but it was fun while it lasted. And, now we're like, okay, we have lives that we need to kind of get back to. So how do we balance that properly?
Those pesky lives always getting in the way of podcasting.
Seriously.
All I want to do is podcast. Well, spending a moment to reflect on the past year in general, you guys mentioned that you took a hiatus. But how has this year been for you both as readers and as podcasters? You know, taking the time off and then coming back, and how is that hiatus good for you guys in terms of reading and all that kind of stuff?
It's a good question. I can start that, Dylan, if you want.
Go for it, Charles.
Unless you got. So right before we took the hiatus, we were saying we're doing 3 episodes a week. At first, it was just Dylan and I. We had no idea how to record anything, especially virtually, and mix it together into a product. We had no idea how to make a podcast, how to upload it and have it so you can download it on like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Like we had no idea. And we went from that to doing 3 episodes a week, interviewing some of our favorite authors. And the last one we interviewed right before the hiatus was Joe Abercrombie, who's like,
dude, that was such an epic interview.
It was, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, it was a huge like moment for us. And then we did that interview and it was great. And then we were like, what the heck do we do now? And we both kind of looked at each other and we're like, like that was kind of like the moment that's like all we wanted was to talk to him. And so the fact that we got to do that, it was like, what do we do next? And, you know, we were like, you know, we've been doing this a lot and we had other stuff we wanted to get on with doing. And we were like, well, let's take a break. And because we always said the first thing is we got to be having fun. And I think at a certain point we were chasing like, it's like, we're putting episodes out. People are talking about it. We're getting attention from authors. We're doing these interviews. It's like, and that we were kind of chasing that. And then I think it was good to kind of pump the brakes on that and come back to like, what is the fun stuff that we want to do? And like, how do we get back to that? And scaling it back to 1 episode a week certainly helps, but also those months that we were taking off just to read for fun, which was still fantasy, but we weren't like reading a book every week or 2 weeks and then writing up a whole kind of in-depth conversation about it. We were just reading for fun and talking about it and, you know, playing video games together and stuff that we would normally been like, any free time we have, we're recording something. We got 3 episodes to put out. So it's been really good. And this year in particular has been really good for us. You know, we took that break and then we came back and we were like, oh my God, people are going to totally forget who we are. But we managed to do some really fun read-alongs with Robert V.S. Reddick was the first one we kind of started coming back with. We got to interview Sarah El-Arifi, who may or may not be brought up again later in this episode. We'll have to see. And a few others along the way. Yeah, thank you. And no, it's been really good. It's been a really good year for us. And we're just excited to be here. Dylan, I don't know if you want to jump in on that, what your year was like.
Yeah,
go for it.
And you covered a lot of it there. I think the thing that I would emphasize that you already got at is just that piece of getting back to reading for fun during the hiatus was so huge. You know, I was going through all these Sanderson books and things like that, and you know how fun those can be. And I just feel like it helped recapture that passion, that love, and why we actually do this and why it's so cool to both read and talk about, but also to interact with all you awesome folks in the community. And then, getting back to it has been great. I mean, we've been so lucky that the community has embraced us coming back, and everyone's been so nice. And we were really worried that everyone would forget about us, but it does feel like we're able to pick back up where we left off, and that's thanks to you all. So it's been really great.
Are we allowed to curse on this podcast, Adrian? Is that encouraged?
Yeah.
What?
Wow.
Okay, good.
He said fuck yeah. That's
hell yeah. So I'd also interviewing Joe Abercrombie was a bit of a mind fuck. I'll say that. And then we needed a little break to kind of compose ourselves. When he was like, Joe Abercrombie's in the Zoom chat and you have to like allow him in, and there he is. And you're like, whoa, okay.
He's
so
bopping his head to that intro song. And it's like, it's, I mean, Adrian, you kind of had a platform prior to doing this, I would say. I mean, you had, your Twitter and I feel like you were interacting. No, you don't see it that way.
I mean, okay, so it's like I started at FanFiAddict last year in like late May, early June.
Gotcha.
And then I started this podcast in August, the very beginning of August.
Okay.
So I had basically like a span of 2 months where I was kind of like ingratiating myself in the community. So
has it only been since August? I feel like you've been doing interviews and stuff. What before that?
I remember you chopping it up with Nick Eames. You're like old friends. It's like
that Nick is because like Nick is a buddy from like over a decade ago, and that was an interview that I did just for the FanFiAddict YouTube channel. And that was at the beginning of June last year.
That's a great interview, by the way.
Yeah,
you guys have such a fun history.
But no, it hasn't been that long, and it feels really crazy to think like you guys talk about like the SFF community, and it's like the writing community, the reading community, these kinds of people are super open and welcoming to all kinds of new voices. And I feel like podcasting is that new space where people are really engaged because they can listen to someone's voice and kind of develop sort of this like, it's a strange thing. Like it's a one-sided relationship, but it feels two-sided. It feels like more reciprocative than it actually is, which is really cool because it's like I'm just listening to these people and I feel like I have a rapport with them even though I've never met them in my life, you know? And that's the cool thing about it. It's like you can just like spout shit and talk to really cool authors and talk to other podcasters and people will, you know, gravitate towards it if you're doing something that's interesting.
Well said. I agree completely. And it's so much fun to see the network start to form of like watching you talk about Nicholas Eames and then we can talk to him about you. And it's just like a fun little like group. And that's some of the most fun that we've had in the past couple of years we've been doing this is getting to talk to authors, creators, fans across the board. It's the people that we've gotten to meet and talk to that have been the most rewarding thing by far in doing all of this.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, like this past year was really crazy just to see like the effort that I put into the podcast was directly, you know, evident in the people that I was meeting and getting to meet more authors, getting to meet more people in the community, getting to meet more PR people from different publishers and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's like, you know, meeting. So it's like I did an interview and a playthrough with Jed Hearn of his game, his like interactive fiction game, Siege of Trebelaine, which is super fun. And we just had a really great time. And then he got back to me about like a month and a half after doing that interview and then asked me to come on to Wizards, Warriors, and Words as like an editor and producer.
Nice.
And that for me was this really cool thing where it's like my love of reading, I feel like this year just really connected in a symbiotic way with everything that I was doing in terms of podcasting. Because it's like I was reading stuff for fun because the stuff I was reading was the stuff I wanted to read, but it was in preparation for talking with the authors, which also just blew my fucking mind. I was like, oh shit, I really love Adrian Tchaikovsky's work and I'm going to talk to him. So I'm going to read his new book. And I'm just like, I can't even, you know.
You guys had some great interviews recently on Wizards, Warriors, Worlds too.
Oh yeah, dude. And Joe Abercrombie as well. It's like David Walters from FanFiAddict.
John Gwynn.
He set me up with Joe, and then I connected Joe and Jed, and that was really cool because it's like I woke up at like 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning because their recording schedule was bonkers, and there's Joe Abercrombie, and they're just shooting the shit, and it's like, all right, bye guys, I'm gonna go eat breakfast, and they're gonna record, and it was like such a crazy moment. So I felt like this year for me was this really beautiful confluence of like reading and podcasting, which is the best possible thing when it comes to doing something like this, right?
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. It sounds like you've really been able to maintain that genuine passion for it. And like, I can feel your gratitude for being able to do these kind of things. And that's definitely how Charles and I try to come at too, right? It's like, if you're anything like us when you first start out, it was like we didn't think anyone would listen, let alone that we would ever have the chance to interact with our favorite authors. So
shouting into the void, we used to call it.
Yeah.
Which it very much
that's what it
was.
feels like at first. Yeah. Because it's like, oh yeah, you're just like you're speaking and then you're listening to your own voice. And at the beginning, I don't know if it was like this for you guys, but it's like I hated the sound of my own voice when I was listening to it on the recording. I'm just like, man, I'm so tired of listening to me. Why would anyone else want to listen to that either?
You got a great voice, Adrian. Have you heard me talk?
Do have a fantastic.
It's awful. I hate listening to my voice, but it's you do get more used to it, I think, and now I try to let Charles do more of the quality control anyway, so I don't have to hear my nasally voice. It's like, I sure love fantasy books. It's like, all right, Dylan, calm down.
I was not doing us any favors in those early days. I didn't know how to edit sound, like voices at all, and I was just amplifying everything. So every like whistle, swallow, everything was like maxed up for the first 3 months we were doing it.
They're still up there too. So if you want to hear what it sounds like, basically inside my mouth when I swallow, that
oh god,
I was like, do I swallow like that loud, Charles? No one tells me.
Yeah, well, it's come a long way for sure.
Oh man, no, I know all too well what you're talking about. It's like there's just something interesting about humans and their speaking mannerisms, and I'm like, wow, every single person that I talk to, I'm just learning something new about them, because I'm like, you go like, or swallow too loud or something like that. And I'm just like, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll edit it out if I can.
It's like, wow, I really say a lot, or or like, or one of those things you kind of catch yourself doing over and over again.
It's like every author out there is like a Valley girl. Like, do you like sci-fi and fantasy?
I know. Once you don't have the veil of the editor, it's like you just unfiltered stuff. It's dangerous.
Yeah, but that's why it's kind of crazy, because it's like we're the editors, we're the self-editors of our own product. It's like, shit, man, if this sounds like crap, it's because of me.
We have no shame. We just
we upload everything.
Exactly. We upload it like one take, and Charles, he does not edit out any ums or likes or anything like that. So
we'll edit out accidental spoilers
or cursing.
That's about it.
Because FTF is family friendly as fuck.
For some reason.
I mean, SFF Addicts is explicit, but I list it as clean because whatever.
Why not?
The bad boy of the SFF community.
Oh shit, man.
That's a good title.
Sorry to everyone out there. Yeah, Adrian the bad boy Gibson.
Yes.
I've been tempted, I've been tempted to just throw them out there, but I'm not as bad as you.
It's not Charles.
But there are
Charles is the good boy of the SFF community.
Yeah.
We complement each other.
Yeah. Exactly. This is why this is a good pairing right now.
I have some guests who are like super into it though. Like Ryan Cahill was just like, the moment I told him it's like you can swear, he just went off, and I was like, I love you, man. You're just amazing. MJ Kuhn too. Like MJ Kuhn was on in October, and same thing. She's like, I said fuck within like the first, I don't know, like 3 minutes or so. And then she just took that as a note, and she's like, all right.
That's off the rails from there.
Setting the tone, bud.
MJ kept it clean on FTF. I never would have known. So it's
because she's a nice one.
She also might get a shout out later.
Maybe. Just maybe.
All right. Well, and I also got a secret to tell you guys after we record.
So. Oh, after. Ooh. I thought you were like, I have a secret to tell you. I was like, okay, it doesn't really count if it's in front of everyone. But you know what? You know what?
I'm gonna tease them.
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna tease the shit out of you all.
Oh yeah.
In like a month, you'll know. But I'm gonna tease the shit out of you.
You are such a bad boy.
He really is.
This is great.
Oh, dude. I'm blushing.
I'm excited.
Oh shit. All right, boys. Well, it is time. Let's dive into our favorite reads of the year. So just so everyone listening and watching understands, we're going to do a bit of a round robin style. So one after the other, book by book. And our choices are going to be a mix of sci-fi, fantasy, maybe some horror, I'm not sure, but also traditional, indie, and self-published. And then each person can rave about one of their favorites. We're aimed for about 4. And if we have some extra time, we'll throw in a few more. But if anyone has read that book or has any commentary after that person's talked about it, you can jump in there with some of your own thoughts on that particular read. So I will start off with my first pick. which is, I brought him up earlier, Mr. Adrian Tchaikovsky. For anyone watching, I have a copy of Eyes of the Void here, which is a chonky boy. It is so thick. This is a doorstopper right here, but it's super beautiful cover and an amazing book in general. This is the second book in the Final Architecture series. Book 1 is Shards of Earth, which is excellent, but Eyes of the Void built on that in so many ways. I'm just like, after speaking to Adrian, I was like, I have no idea how you write so fast. You're just like a maniac, but brilliant at the same time. But the fact that he manages to pack so much, world building and character development and, fun action scenes and really fun conversations, but also so many things like extremely nerdy tidbits. The fact that he just like has a few lines or like a single line about like the biology of an alien species, and my mind just churns like crazy after reading that line. It's like, wait, they're like clams, but they're like giant clam. What the fuck is going on? And so my mind just goes off and off when I'm reading his books, because the mix of world building and character and things like biology and consciousness and psychology, which are some of his backgrounds academically, they just jump off the page. And for me, it's like, these are really chonky books, like Shards of Earth is 500 plus pages. Eyes of the Void is, nearing 600, but they read so fast because I'm just so engrossed in the world. And the thing that really, really caught me about this series is the way that, okay, so Shards of Earth, the first book in the series, the cover of it is literally like a planet being ripped apart by some giant alien entity. And so that's kind of the setup for this whole series, is there's an alien species called the Architects. And the Architects, what they do is they reshape planets, to their liking. And it's kind of like a genocidal form of like artistic expression, if I can put it that way. But for them, it's something that is kind of part of their nature. But obviously for us, or for an alien species that's living on a planet, this is destruction. This is apocalypse. And so it's this really epic scale of humans and different alien species coming to grips with the threat of these Architects. And the fact that they came and then they disappeared. This is not spoilers, because this is like literally the synopsis and like first chapter of the book. But the way that he builds upon it in terms of establishing the main characters and kind of having this crew mentality, because I really like a good crew in a book. And he has all these different crew members from different backgrounds with different talents. And it kind of feels like a heist in that way. Not that there's a heist that goes on, but it kind of has that cohesion of this like really cool group, and how they like fight with each other, how they agree with each other, how there's like romantic subplots and stuff going on is really, really cool. But for me, the thing that really sets it apart is his ability to sort of establish mysteries. So there's a ton of mysteries in Shards of Earth. And Eyes of the Void answers a lot of those questions. But then it establishes even more mysteries, which I know in the third book, Lords of Uncreation, which is coming out in the spring, he's just going to blow everything out of the water and, just fuck with my mind in amazing ways. But yeah, Eyes of the Void, it establishes, this really galactic scale of threat and stakes. And the characters, the way that they're embroiled in that is just so much fun. So it's this amazing mix of fun, action, science, aliens, crazy like galactic mysteries and spaceships, and like the best of space opera is essentially what I can say about it. And I cannot wait for book 3. That is like top of my list.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know if any of you have read Shards of Earth, or at least any Adrian Tchaikovsky.
I have not, but he was on Wizards, Warriors, and Words like way back, right? Like,
yep.
And probably multiple times since.
I think like 2021.
Yeah, I think I remember that's where he first ended up on my radar, was when they're interviewing him, I think toward the beginning of the of the podcast run, and I was like, this guy, like his understanding of the mechanics, like world building and just storytelling in general, I was like, I gotta check this guy's work out, and I see it in the bookstore too. I think sometimes I get overwhelmed. Like he has a decent amount of books, right? Like it's
he releases like at least 2 or 3 books a year.
Wow. So I'm like, I guess my question for you, Adrian, is where do you recommend that folks start with this series, or whereabouts?
Okay, I've got 2 angles here.
Okay,
if you want more space opera and more of like a propellant kind of story, I would say start with Shards of Earth.
Okay.
If you want something that is more scientific, but still a very engaging story, but just slower paced, I would start with Children of Time. And then if you want fantasy, he also has his Shadows of the Apt series and a bunch of fantasy stuff as well. So it's like he comes at it from like so many different angles, where he writes fantasy, he writes science fiction, he writes hard sci-fi, but he also writes space opera. So I'd say that like three entry points. It's like if you exactly.
Sleep.
He has these beautiful eyebrows, and I was joking with one of my friends from FanFiAddict. It's like his creative power is in those eyebrows, you know? Yeah.
So every it's like, book he writes, they just get more powerful.
They get longer. So yeah, fantasy, Shadows of the Apt, hard sci-fi, Children of Time, space opera, Shards of Earth is my recommendation.
It's been a while since I've read a good space opera. That's kind of the hook you got in me. The other one is like, how great is it when an author can pull off a satisfying mystery? I feel like that's such a hard thing to do, but when you pull it off, it is like one of the most entertaining things you can experience as a reader. I mean, action's great and all that, but man, a mystery where you're like, it's like all in front of you, and yet it still somehow manages to click together in a way you couldn't predict. Like, that's a very impressive thing to do as an author.
Hell yeah. Yeah. Well, Charles, what's your pick?
Oh man, well, this is the first one I want to get out here just to make sure it gets out there, because of all of the books that I have prepared, this I think was the only one that actually came out this year. And I kind of teased their name a little earlier, so I don't want to, tease the name and then not say their book. And I'm talking about The Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi. This is another pretty decently sized fantasy book. I don't have a copy on me. The publisher actually gave us a digital copy before it came out, which was super cool. Not a thing that happens to us a lot, that we get an advance copy of a book. And then beyond that, we get to do an advance interview of an author. And that's the thing that when we talk about what makes this year so special for me particularly, and Dylan too, in the world of fantasy, was the fact that we got to be part of this like a little piece of this part of this launch of The Final Strife. And when we met Sarah El-Arifi, her book was coming out like in 2 days. This was her first book. She was like, I'm so nervous but excited, and like, this is my first book. We'll see how it goes. And we read it and we're like,
you'll be fine.
You'll be fine. Like, this book is really good, and it's a really strong debut. It's just exactly like on the cusp of what I think a lot of fantasy fans are looking for, and a lot of what the genre is kind of going towards in terms of like prioritizing action and also this interesting like inclusivity and diverse voices and things like that, but brought in just like this most exciting, like adrenaline rushing way, and also very thought provoking too. And I will say this, okay, we interviewed her and we released the episode. A few days later, her book comes out and it becomes a Sunday Times bestseller. Now, I'm not saying that, we had any part of that, but if you look at the sequence of events, it's like FDF episode comes out, then book becomes bestseller. I don't know how that works, but you guys,
to all the authors out there,
exactly.
We call it the FDF bump, which is also Charles's signature move at the FDF Christmas party.
Oh yeah.
That also sounds like a very nerdy sex position.
That's on the table talking about sex positions on the show, Charles. We can finally chop it up about that. And
bad boy, at it again.
Yeah, the bad boy always having to make about sex and violence
Dylan,
and
you
rock
didn't
and
tell
roll.
me we were getting on the show with a bad boy. My goodness.
I thought you'd have known by now with his reputation. So anyway,
Seriously.
the bad boy, he loves sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I'll say drugs do feature heavily in the Final Strife, right?
Instead of rock and roll, it has griots playing like rhythmic drums and storytelling. So it's sex, drugs, and griot performances, I guess, is what you could say that this book has.
Nice.
For those of you that don't know, this is the debut novel. It's the beginning of a trilogy called the Ending Fire trilogy, and it's a book that has its mythology based in like African and Arabian roots in terms of its world building, cool. Which is a very interesting setting. And there's both magic and also this intense like class system. And what's interesting about the class system is that it's based on the color of your blood, but everyone looks the same on the outside. Right. It's not like the rich class has a different outward appearance than the poor class. It's just the color of their blood is different. Of course, the lowest class, they actually cut their hands and tongues off, so they look visibly different. But before that, it just would have been the color of their blood, which is a really interesting premise when one of your themes is like class structure and racism. It's like the roots of that can be like when you all look the same, like what really is the difference? Like, come on, so your blood's a different color. Like, how would you even know or care about that unless you weren't like put into this slot in society? And that's kind of the world that this is built on. The main character, Shyla, she's at the very beginning of the book. This is not a spoiler. She is a red blood that was like stolen at birth with the goal of like growing up amongst the middle class, which has blue blood, and then like kind of trying to, the final strife, I guess, is like trying to kind of take out the upper class. And she's like trained for this her whole life. Like, I'm going to take on the upper class. And there's this big tournament that happens with all the young adults in the world that they get to compete in this huge epic series of games that it's only the nobility can play. So because she has red blood, she can go in there and play and potentially win a powerful seat in government. And that's how this book takes off.
Change the whole system.
Exactly. And so of course that's the goal. Things get complicated along the way. There's interesting romances. There's some LGBT romances involved there. And it's just like a really challenging book. And Shyla as a character is very challenging as well. She's battling drug abuse and like love triangles and classism and racism. And like, it's as exciting as it is like challenging and thought-provoking. And I think that's what made it the Sunday Times bestseller, is that it's able to do both. And Dylan and I have had this conversation a few times where because we read it digitally, it didn't have like page numbers or anything. It was just like a PDF that kind of kept going. And when the book finally came out and we saw it was like 600 pages, like we both thought it was 400, So like the fact that like we could both be fooled by that and we just burned through it is as much of a testament as I can give in terms of review. And Sarah is just so nice and so talented and so smart too. Like super, when she was on the podcast, it's one of our favorite interviews, and she was just so generous with her time and her knowledge and her experiences. And she has some really great, fascinating stories about like the people she was able to talk to and the advice she was given along the way. So definitely worth doing more research into her. But yeah, the Final Strife, she just announced a few weeks ago or a few months ago, I guess now, the title of her second book, The Battle Drum. So greatly looking forward to that. And yeah, it came out this year, so super exciting, cutting edge fantasy here, guys.
Man, that sounds amazing. Just a quick comment, like the blood thing is really interesting because, dealing with classism in that context, it's like so often in situations where there is this sort of like racism and classism, a lot of it kind of boils down to this idea of like your blood is like filthy or tainted.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting that she actually used blood as like a very literal metaphor in that sense of like, yeah, your blood is quite literally lower class,
Well
but
said.
then obviously that's just the context of the society that it takes place in.
Well said. And there's a whole magic system built into that too that I won't get too into, other than to say that it's like depending on the blood you have, it affects magical ability too, which is very interesting. It's just like another layer into what you're getting at, Adrian.
Oh, cool. Dylan, what are your thoughts since you also read the book and you also chatted with her?
Yeah, incredible book and wonderful person for sure. This one would have been, Charles and I did a little coordination behind the scenes, and like his first text was, I was basically knowing he would want to talk about the Final Strife particularly, and I was like, already typing, I was like, okay, you can have it, fine, but I would have included, and his at the same time,
our text messages crossed. I was like dibs on Final Strife, and he's like, okay, you can have it.
Like literally where you're both typing at the same time, because I just knew that's where he'd go. Yeah, it's right there among my favorite reads as well, but Charles so eloquently explains it and what's about and what makes it so great. But yeah, it's the pacing is incredible. That's something that I really love is I don't need the slow burn usually. I'm like, let's just get going, and that's something that Sarah does extremely well with the Final Strife, and it it goes to show it that Charles and I were completely fooled by the page count, like he was saying. And Charles said it does both. Get you a book that can do both. This one, it's got those kind of capital L literature is what we like to call it, like capital L literature style themes, and that caste system is really well fleshed out. It's also got that pacing and just like a fun fantasy story at the same time. It's such a hard balance to strike. And I'll also say it's really interesting how Sarah wrote a character with a substance use disorder. Like I'm in psychology, so I'm always I guess I can be a little on edge sometimes when authors start writing about folks with like mental health disorders, and I'm like, okay, let's see. And you can really tell that Sarah did her research, and it's like she's really tight to the point of view, so it goes really well because there's not always this like awareness on behalf of the main character around the ways in which her substance use might be affecting her and those around her, but it's very clearly there in the subtext, and it's just done in such a deft way. So fantastic book, and if Charles wasn't here to talk about it, it'd be on my list.
Damn. Okay, I gotta check this out. Yeah, I'm gonna definitely link to the interview that you guys did with her. But I gotta read this book, man. That sounds fantastic. It kind of gives me vibes of like Evan Winter, The Rage of Dragons, which is like, super propellant, but also dealing with some really difficult themes in a capital L literature kind of way that you mentioned, Dylan. So it's like that sounds like a really good read, because it's like that combination of fast pacing and really deep world building, but also that kind of personal stuff. Because like I'm a character reader, and if a character is dealing with something, not necessarily just substance abuse, Mr. Bad Boy, but
you're like, but you call that substance abuse?
Amateur. But to have a character that is really dealing with something and struggling along their journey, for me, always makes things much more satisfying.
And the main character does struggle quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll also say definitely check out that interview, not because of us, but because of Sarah and how insightful she is to all those listening. And I'll say entirely thanks to her, we sold more books off of that interview than any other interview we've done, at least based on people's feedback. Like so many people were letting us know after, like, oh, hey, I went out and bought this book like right after the interview. And that's because like once you hear Sarah talk about it, you're really going to want to read it. So, I love that interview.
Me too.
Awesome. And Dylan, what's your first pick?
Yeah, so I'll start with what's probably like the hip new, like probably a lot of people's number one choices for like top book of the year. So I'll be very basic here and go with Babel, or The Necessity of Violence. And I always love those titles that are like, I don't know if this is what played out here, but I always feel like it's like the title that the publisher wanted, or the title that the author actually wanted. So
quick note. This is by R.F. Kuang, by Rebecca Kuang.
Yes.
But that I think that's something that they kind of ripped off. Like, no offense to anyone who uses it, like Luke Tarzian, love you, buddy. I think it's kind of a play on Dr. Faustus. And that sort of like, there's a title and then a subtitle that's kind of a little cheeky, but also like you say, it's like publisher's choice, author's choice.
Well,
I always think
the
of
movie
Birdman. Or the unexpected virtue of ignorance. I'm like, I love that unexpected virtue of ignorance. So yes, we've got Rebecca Kuang. R.F. Kuang is what she goes by on her fiction writing, but it is, #1 New York Times bestseller. Blackwell's Book of the Year. Barnes & Noble named it one of the top 10 books of the year. That's just like period, not necessarily the fantasy genre or SFF, just top 10 book of the year. It's a finalist right now for 2022 Goodreads Choice Awards for fantasy. I would not be surprised at all if this ends up taking the Hugo or the World Fantasy Award or whatever. Locus. Nebula, sure, right? Like this is just an award season darling of a book, but it's also, like I said, #1 New York Times bestseller. So it's kind of that same bit of get you a book that can do both. So it's definitely for folks who have read the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, which is another one of our favorite series and more kind of militaristic fantasy and more grand and epic in its scale. This does slow things down a lot. It's a different kind of book. It's this story that follows basically a cohort of characters who are enrolled in a fictionalized Oxford set in the 19th century. And it's mostly a similar world, but the biggest difference is this idea of silver being able to be used as a part of a magic system based on translation. And I won't get too into the weeds with it. I think it's probably a spoiler a little bit if I do too, but it's really interesting. It's really academic in nature, the book and the magic system. It's like dark academia at its finest. So folks who really like that, they'll feel at home here. The characters are awesome and nuanced, and we really get to just chill out and spend time with them in a way that we don't in the Poppy War trilogy, because the plot, it just moves super fast, which I'm not complaining about, but you get more time to just hang out and get to know the characters in a more, I guess, relaxed setting, just going to school. It appeals to me a lot because I'm getting my PhD right now, so the idea of a cohort and spending a lot of time together and then working really hard in classes, all that kind of stuff.
Where's your magic, Dylan?
I know, it's the worst. It's like I have to do the same amount of all the studying and going to classes. I don't even get to do magic. It's like,
damn it.
Yeah, it's a total bummer. But it's awesome how in this book they get to, and it's a really smart magic system. Just like it's very focused on like things that get lost in translation and stuff, and those are big themes in this book, which I think the book it's probably like biggest sell point is these big picture themes. Like it really gets into an incredibly well handled ways. Colonialism, oppression, racism, the power of language, and all of those kind of things are what's going to help make it this continued critical darling, like I was saying. It can be a bit dense, though. I do want to give that heads up. Like there's literally footnotes like all over this thing, and it's
I love that though.
Oh yeah, I don't mind because I'm used to the academic reading, but you can tell that Rebecca Kuang just is letting that side. She got a master's from Oxford, and she called this both her love letter and her breakup note. I don't know,
with academia,
paraphrasing, but like, yeah, breakup letter and love letter to Oxford, because she is trying to point out all of these like fundamental issues with like especially some of these prestigious universities and the system, and how colonialism played a huge role in them becoming what they are. And most of the characters in the cohort are people who are basically taken from other countries as children because they demonstrate this talent to be able to use this magic system potentially in some way. And then they're kind of treated in a way where it's like, oh, you should be so grateful. You got taken from your country, India, China, etc., and you're brought to amazing England, and we provide you with all these things and an education and all that stuff. And it's them grappling with some of this guilt that they feel, and that comes from like, oh, but they have provided us with all of these things, but also they basically took them away from their actual culture and denied them the experience of growing up there. So it's just like very complex things, and handled by someone with just masterful talent for writing, and also an academic understanding of these things that is beyond anything I could ever comprehend. So it's yeah, very impressive book. It does feel in some ways more mature than the Poppy War, or not that the Poppy War was immature, but I do think that it's totally moving more toward that Capwell literature. And the sources she's citing in here are legitimate academic sources. They're not just made up things in the world. And yeah, she drives home her points, because it's this book, I think everything is kind of secondary to the themes and the message. Include like the characters are great, but I do think like she will prioritize the themes above those. So, and she delivers her point extremely well. The I think it's like almost an essay in fiction form, which I mean that in a positive way. When I hear myself say it, it doesn't sound as nice.
Yeah, it's like hopefully no one gets turned off by that. But for me, it sounds really intriguing. It's like that's one of the reads from this year that I haven't been able to get to, but I have bought it as sort of I do like 3 or 4 book hauls throughout the year, and that's in my latest book haul, which I just ordered last week. But man, it's so crazy. So this idea of like the people being brought over from these different countries to England, and and then them sort of developing this crazy sort of Stockholm syndrome,
right?
And this guilt of like, shouldn't we be appreciative of blah blah blah? But it's like, no, these people, like the ways in which England and other empires took resources from other countries, or like your beloved United States has done.
Who said for a lot rooting for us in the World Cup. I mean, that's the one time you gotta go real patriotic. But
yeah, you're mediocre United States.
The powerhouse of a country.
Exactly. How these big empires have like, stolen so much from other countries in terms of resources, but also how they stole people as a resource. And so it's kind of like these people with the power that they have to translate are essentially like humans as resources, just for their ability to come over and live a privileged life. But it's like, we're grooming you to do something that we want and we need. And you're essentially a resource, because other than that, it's like we would have left you back in your shithole country or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, I think you'll really appreciate this book, Adrian. You're definitely tapping into a lot of what's explored in this novel, and yeah, it is a lot of that. And then while all the like stuffy old white British men academics are telling them how grateful they should be, and yeah, it's not. I'll say you can probably guess which side Kwong is coming down on in this debate, but she doesn't straw man the other side. I think she actually does a good job of trying to flesh that out and make those people actually seem like they believe what they do because of their own biases and their own way of being brought up, but not because they're just, stupid people who are incapable of understanding anything. It's like, no, they're just trapped in their own narratives, the same way that most people are.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance, and Rebecca's super nice. It's like I haven't had her on the show, but we've exchanged emails before, and yeah, she's just super down to earth kind of person. And this book, yeah, I love. Even though some people are just like, oh, the Poppy War series is so dark, and it's like you can call it grimdark if you want to, but then again, it's like depends what kinds of themes you're willing to read and absorb, and sometimes they're not good pills to swallow, but it still makes for like engaging and thought-provoking books to read. It's just, the Poppy War was a lot more about military and sort of like rigid social structures and war and the devastation of violence and things like that. But I appreciate that she took a mirror to academia in this new book, and I'm really excited to read it.
Yeah, I think you'll love it.
All right. Well, I will share my next pick, which is Locklands by Robert Jackson Bennett. So this is book 3 in the Founders trilogy. So the first book is Foundryside, second book is Shorefall, and then book 3 is Locklands. And this book broke me in the best possible way. I mentioned to you guys earlier how a lot of the stuff that I read this year was in preparation for interviews and podcast guests and stuff like that. And I had the pleasure of chatting with Robert back in June, and then had him again on the podcast for a heists and capers author panel back in October. And it is just so fascinating to have this like dichotomy of the author themselves versus the work that they produce. Because in virtual person, talking to Robert, he is so fucking cheeky, but you can see the gears churning in his head of how brilliant he is, in terms of the ways in which he views things like history and politics, and mythology and religion and all these different topics. But the way that he infuses all of that into the Founders trilogy is absolutely stunning. For the first book, Foundryside, starts out with this one POV character, Sancha, in a sort of, how would I call it? Sort of like a techno-inspired Renaissance Italy. So I will hands down say this is like the best cyberpunk book and cyberpunk series I've ever read. And he backed up my theory, which is that he wanted to write a cyberpunk book and ended up just like writing it into a fantasy world, because the approaches that he takes are so rooted in cyberpunk sort of foundations, but the ways in which he builds that into a fantasy world is just brilliant. So it's this kind of Renaissance Italy inspired world. Main character is a thief, sort of like a street urchin, getting by pickpocketing people and pulling off jobs and heists and that kind of stuff. But she's super approachable. She's a shit, just like a really, bitter person, but that kind of makes sense for the context of growing up on the streets. But then she develops and really grows on you. And it's like, if you read Foundryside and really love it, the rest of the series will really appeal to you, because, it establishes so much in that first book in terms of the tone, the pacing. The pacing is really good, and it's fast when it needs to be and a little bit slowed down when it needs to be as well. But the thing for me that really just captured me is A, the world building, and B, the magic system. And so the magic system is called scriving. And this is where the sort of cyberpunk element comes in, because it's essentially like hacking objects. So this isn't really a spoiler because it plays into the very beginning of Foundry Side, but it's like certain people have the ability to, sort of like scribe or carve sigils onto different objects and imbue them with a certain command. And so it's like coding, essentially. And so these different objects have different command codes, and they combine different codes in more complex ways in order to give something a more complex set of capabilities. So it could be like you scribe codes for motion onto wheels, and then that causes them to self-propel and carry a carriage or a cart or something like that. And so that magic system is so cool in the way in which it plays into the whole world, but also the ways in which it plays into Sancha as a character. And the way those two things intertwine is just beautiful. And then Shorefall builds on that by bringing in more of the world building and the mythology. Essentially, there's like an ancient master race that created scribing, but has long since been lost. And it's kind of playing with these ideas of, the power of humans to play God. And so once again, this kind of plays back into cyberpunk themes of creation and creating artificial intelligences and stuff like that. But all of it in a fantasy setting, which is really cool. And so that second book, Shorefall, really plays with this idea of mythology and history and power. Book 3 just, took everything established in the first two books in terms of, the characters that were set up in the first book, expanding upon them in book 2. And then by book 3, really hitting home how these relationships have developed. Because there are time jumps between each book. I think between book 1 and 2, there's like a year or two. And then between book 2 and 3, there's an 8-year time jump. And so this kind of allowed Robert Jackson Bennett to develop their relationships a bit more behind the scenes, but also in a way that feels very natural and rooted in the context of what the story needs to tell. And so all of the threads that he's laying out in the first two books hit hard, so hard in book 3, because it's like the characters, you really grow to love them and their relationships. Sancha and another character sort of have this lesbian relationship, which is really beautiful, but all the characters have this kind of found family vibe. And that found family really grows on you. So by the time book 3 rolls around, when it comes to heartbreak, when it comes to betrayals, when it comes to really, really difficult decisions on this scale that is so massive because of all the mythology that's built up in book 2 comes to play in book 3 in this sort of world-ending way. And so all of you guys were talking about mysteries earlier. Holy shit. He establishes mystery after mystery, but he does not let a single thread hang loose. Everything is tied up, but the ways in which he ties it up is so, it's just sublime. And on one hand, it's really beautiful, and on the other hand, it's really brutal. So it's like, this is the one book this year that made me cry. And I did not expect that coming from such a cheeky dude. I'm like, he has such a rich humor, but then when he has those moments that hit in this book, they're just heart-wrenching. And I don't want to spoil anything else, because I think everyone who reads Locklands after reading the first two books needs to experience that in a way that is wholly, unique to them and unique to their experience with the series. But the series ends in such a bittersweet way. And I love bittersweet endings because I don't like everything to be wrapped up so neatly, but I also don't like things to be so, depressing and unfulfilling. But it's just beautiful. And in a very cyberpunk way, he kind of presents the potential of this sort of like post-human utopia in the end, but all of this wrapped in a fantasy package. And I'm just blown away by what he was able to accomplish with this series. So I cannot recommend it enough. This is like the book that just tore me apart and then put me back together.
Wow. That is high praise.
Yeah. Do you think it could make Charles cry? Because Charles has notoriously never cried from reading in his entire life.
Not even from Dumbledore's death in Harry Potter?
No.
I don't give a shit.
Who's like
What?
on Goblet of Fire right now and is like, what?
Yeah, I'm sorry to ruin Harry Potter for you. Whatever.
Snape kills Dumbledore, guys. Sorry. But
Snape's not what you think.
Exactly. No, not from Dumbledore.
No.
Charles was happy.
I think, I don't know. If you read Foundry Side and you like it, tell me. There's a possibility that you might get a little teary-eyed by the time Locklands wraps up.
Right. Well, I mean,
Charles
there's a
still
lot
needed eye drops after reading the Paper Menagerie, so I don't think
don't expose me
dried out completely. Still, it's like,
oh my god.
But no, there's a lot of stuff, Adrian, that you said that I like, and what you were talking about is sense of humor, which we're always chasing books with a unique sense of humor when the author's voice can kind of come through in that way.
Mm-hmm.
The other one you said is like, there's something to be said in the world of like sci-fi fantasy when you can kind of get lost into the minutia of a magic system. Something like Mistborn comes to mind, where it's complicated, but that's kind of what makes it good, because it's so easy to write just a magic system or a science fiction world that's complicated and confusing, and you're like, okay, whatever. But when you're writing a system that you're like learning as the book goes, and it's intricate and it's developed and it affects the characters and the world, and you're like eager to learn more, and when you learn more it only makes it more interesting. That's very hard to do, and it can be a very rewarding experience. It's what propelled something like Mistborn to be like one of those staples in the genre. So you describing this kind of scientific magic system here in Locklands, that's a very appealing thing for me as well.
Yeah, the magic system is brilliant because funny enough, he had to tone some stuff back because his editor was just like, it's too much.
Yeah, he's nerding out too much.
Which case, he's nerding out so much, but it's so cool because it's like, from anyone who comes from a coding background, I think you'd really love this because of the ways in which problem solving takes place from a plot and a character perspective is directly interlocked with the ways in which this magic system works and the systems of functionality between, scribing something into an object, and then the actual sort of like command objectives of that carving and that sigil is so cool to see, like, what this object is essentially like thinking in terms of like, my command is to talk. And so it's like repeating ways in which it talks and the ways in which it has to approach talking, which is so fun because it gives objects personality in such a cool way. Yeah.
It's very interesting. I've never coded anything in my life, but I'm still interested.
No, I think you would love it. If you like Mistborn, I think you would really dig this. Charles, what's your next pick?
Okay, well, I'm looking at a stack here, but I think I got to pick the one that, we had been on hiatus for several months, and we planned our comeback, was very calculated, and we were kind of like building up to it, and we were like, what's going to be that like defining, like, we're back guys, don't worry kind of statement. And that to me is
don't
like,
forget about us.
Yes, that is a huge, like, when I look back at this year, one of the biggest things that we did on the show was read this book. And one of the things that people who don't listen to our show might not know is that we kind of divide responsibilities between the two of us, and we kind of take ownership over different things. I edit the show, and Dylan controls our social media. And when one person has total unchecked control over a social media account that you both share, it's only natural that some bias kind of leaks through into the voice of our social media presence.
Hey, I'm just gonna interrupt for a second.
Please do.
He explicitly says tweets by Dylan.
Thank you, Adrian.
That doesn't stop all of a sudden, you're minding your own business and all of a sudden people are telling you like, hey, you should really read this book. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
So sorry that the fans recommend you books, Charles. I mean,
well, what happened was when you're looking away, he starts this whole crusade, this whole movement online that I just was not part of. But for years now, one of Dylan's favorite books that he always kept recommending was the book I'm talking about right now, The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. It's been out for a very long time. And I remember when Dylan was visiting me when I was still living in New Orleans and he was reading this series and he was like, it was really good. You got to check it out. And I was like, okay. So what happened but what happened was, I know I'm trying to channel because of the years that follow, right? Yeah. So he's recommended it. He's pitched it. We have a segment where the way we choose what to read is we pitch books to each other and we pick one of each other's books and that's what we read. And he picked it and he pitched it and I famously did not pick it because I knew, look, there's two things. You know when someone recommends something to you so strongly that you're like, I'll get around to it. It's almost like they recommended it too strongly that you
don't want to read it out of spite.
It almost has, exactly. It has like the adverse effect of like, I'm going to ignore it even harder now.
Imagine you're just a spiteful, hateful person, Adrian. Put yourself in the shoes
I am describing
of that kind of person.
A very common
I can very
psychological thing that happens, Dylan. Everyone can relate to this. But then also, I had this hang up before we started FTF. I had this hang up where it's like I didn't want to start a fantasy series that wasn't finished. I was like, or wasn't planned to be finished, right? So that prevented me from reading a lot of very popular fantasy. But
there's a lot of plans
to not finish.
What?
I don't know if anyone plans to not finish.
Yeah,
but it's like you read Game of Thrones, for example, and you read them all, and then by the time the next book comes out, you'll have totally forgotten what you read, and you have to read it over again. So I'm like, well, I'll just wait until the last one's out, and then I'll read them all, and won't have to read anything multiple times. And that's just kind of where my head was at. But
that's fair.
So that kind of, even though I wanted to read this book, it was always on my radar. I never kind of got around to it. And then over the 2 years we've done the show, like when I tell you, we've had people, no one ever sends us emails, but when the few times they've done, people begging me to read this book. I was like, whoa, really? Like people really want me to read this? And then people message me all the time. I couldn't say anything without the comments underneath being like, read Lockmore, read Lockmore.
Charles doesn't go on Twitter a lot. He has his personal account. He just like tweet something and just be like 4 people telling him to read.
We would have guests on the show and they would make fun of me for not reading it. Multiple guests, mind you, have come on and done that. It was like a thing about our show that I wasn't reading this book. So the time and I had fun not reading it too. It was like I almost don't want to read it because it's a part of my identity that will become erased once I read it. But we had lots of jokes. They kind of ran their course and I was like, we've been on break for a while. We're trying to come back and I think it would be very fun for us to tease and finally read and discuss The Lies of Locke Lamora. And it was a fantastic book. What can I say? It lived up to the hype. It's, we enjoy cursing on this show, and this book takes cursing to a whole new, it's a beautiful art in this book. Like some of the best cursing I've ever read in my life. Lies of Locke Lamora. Obviously, Locke Lamora starts this book as an orphan and in the island city of Comore, which is kind of like a Venice Mediterranean vibe around it. And he kind of gets spared from being an orphan destined to live a short life to become like a protege to a con artist. And he kind of learns the like art of thievery. And eventually he kind of gets a little too ambitious. And that's what's fun about this book. It's like the give and take of like, it's surprisingly compassionate as it is cutthroat. It's surprisingly violent as it is funny. And like the way we run the whole spectrum of emotion and character traits and violence, it's a really just fun, exciting series to read, and the dialogue between these guys. Like, so many times I've read like clever or witty or funny dialogue, and I want to like puke, but this is really, really good. Like, really
Charles
funny
has
stuff.
Puked while reading a book, but never cried.
I said want to, not that it's ever happened.
Work in the right
but
way
even some of like the best-selling authors in the world, when their clever character comes out, you roll your eyes a little bit. But this is fantastic, and I don't know if I need to get too much into this.
That's a shot at one author in particular, but he'll remain.
It's nameless. A shot at it's a common trap. It's not an easy thing to pull off, but that this book excels at. Every character is like the clever one in this book, and that's what makes it so much fun. I mean, it's a national bestseller. It's been out for a long time. I don't need to hype it up too much, other than if you love rogues, if you love just fun action, funny dialogue, and you haven't read this yet, don't be like me and just pick it up. You won't regret it. And that's The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. There is more, but this was a really solid standalone, I think. And you know, the other books are popular as well, and I know the series has been ongoing for a very, very long time. And Scott Lynch actually recently, shortly after, mind you, we read this book, he started tweeting that he was getting back into the game, and I was like, oh wow, what a fortunate timing is this, that our episode comes out and all of a sudden Scott Lynch is tweeting again. So who knows, maybe we'll see something in the not too distant future. But even just reading this book on its own, it stands very solid as a standalone experience, and there's more to offer if you want to read more. So yeah, loved it
Wholeheartedly agree with you. One of the best friendships in fantasy. So between Locke and Jean Tannen.
One of my favorite things was when people ask, what's the best fantasy duo? I would always say that, or when talking about the book, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's Jean and Locke. Like, I had no idea what I was talking about, but so many people had told me that and recommended it. I feel like I knew more about this book having never read it than any other book in the world. And that's one of the things, like, oh, Jean and Locke. I know that.
I will say, so I reread it when we did our discussion there, and the best Locke and Jean moments are later in the series, I do think. Obviously, there are a bunch of good ones in The Lies of Locke Lamora, but I think Charles left feeling slightly underwhelmed just with everyone with just that relationship, with everyone telling him, and I think rightfully so, that those are one of, if not the best, like, duo or friendships in
I could tell it was only getting started in this one.
It is only getting started. So,
but it is the curse of hype as well.
Yes, the curse of hype. I think if it weren't for the hype, he still would have been like, oh wow, these are a great like duo. But I think when everyone's telling you haven't read this and they're like, this is the best duo ever, you're like, I'll see.
Yeah, it's like Royce and Adrian and Locke and Jean. Like, those are like the two duos that get tossed around all the time.
Yeah. You know who actually recommended this book to me? This was way back in the day, but when Nicholas Eames and I were working at a restaurant together, I saw him reading The Lies of Locke Lamora.
Wow.
And he recommended it to me.
Funny background.
And you know, I respect him more than you respect Dylan, so I read it pretty quick.
It's not even close.
Wow. I bet it would be something Eames would love. He's got such a like unique sense of humor about him too. And you know, also a guy who's not afraid to swear. I see he's a bad influence on you, Adrian. You got to look out for that Nicholas Eames guy.
No, I was a bad boy before I met him.
There you go. So you were the bad influence.
Who knows what kind of stuff they were getting up to after work, you know?
We can only imagine.
Yeah.
It was mostly like he's like 10 years older than me, so it was mostly like us going to the bar together with all of our coworkers and just Nick being like the pensive guy sitting off in the corner drinking a whiskey, but super witty.
Yeah.
Always had a good comment to throw.
For sure.
And then he would just laugh at us because we're just like young and trying to get in people's pants and getting drunk and stuff. So.
Classic bad boy of fantasy or SFF total behavior. Yeah.
Yes.
He's only gotten wilder since. So.
Oh, of course. Of course. All right, Dylan, what's your next pick?
Well, I think that leads really well into a book that's inspired by The Lies of Locke Lamora and Scott Lynch.
And that was teased earlier in the show for all you people paying attention at home.
Yeah, Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn. So, I mean, this one, it is just so much fun. That's the number one thing that comes to mind with this book. I mean, and with the author MJ, just a wonderful person. She's been on your show and she's been on our show, so friend of the shows and fantastic writer. Much like The Lies of Locke Lamora, it's got this thieving crew composed of these morally gray characters, and the difference, I think, between, well, one of the differences between these crews, the one in The Lies of Locke Lamora, there's a lot of love within the crew, and everyone, it's like a family. And among thieves, everyone's planning on betraying every other person in the crew. So it's a fun twist, and definitely, it's rogues, it's heists, it's thieves. It's like, it makes sense that they're all selfish and willing to betray each other. So I really appreciated MJ's willingness to lean into that. I read this coming off of, I just read Samantha Shannon's The Priory of the Orange Tree. And, to quote the legend, Ringo Starr, like peace and love, but was not my favorite book. And another like Curse of Hype book, The Priory.
It's also super big.
Yeah, it's a chunker.
That thing is freaking gigantic. So it's one of those books that you like read for a long time, and then you're like, I don't know how I like didn't make any progress at all, but it looks like I'm on the same like page I start.
Or like I've lost pages, like I'm back.
To the am I reading this backwards? It's like so, and it just, lots of people love that book and peace and love and all that. It wasn't a fit for me, and it's 800 plus pages and just giant, and it's what Brandon Sanderson would have called a Chihuahua killer of a book. So it's,
he's the king of the Chihuahua killers.
Oh yeah, I mean, this guy's responsible for many Chihuahua deaths, Brandon Sanderson, at the hands of his books. Not all on purpose. You could just fall off and your Chihuahua's under it, and rest in peace. But it's rest in peace and love. So it's anyway, it was a big difference to go from The Priory of the Orange Tree, which was long and all this world building, and it just didn't feel like I was making any progress with it, and then move toward Among Thieves, which just has this like fast moving plot. It's got all this witty dialogue and funny stuff. I remember I'd be sitting in a cafe reading it as during our hiatus, actually, and I would just start laughing, and I was like, oh no, like, this is one of these books that if I read it in public, I'm going to embarrass myself. So not as bad as when Charles is reading a book and he just vomits, like
in a cafe, right into my coffee.
Yeah, they're like, sir, was your coffee okay? And he's like, no, I'm just reading a character that the author thinks is clever but isn't. And this though,
and then the barista gives him a clever, witty remark, and then he vomits again. It's just endless.
Exactly.
Because he knows it so well.
Yeah. So unlike the books that make Charles puke, this does have just great dialogue, and is actually really funny, and the characters, they're charming and really memorable. They each have a very clear, unique voice, and it's to the point, some of the best character writers, when they do rotating point of view, it's like you just feel the prose change in between the different characters. And that's something that I think MJ does really well. Like, if you look at the difference between her characters, like there's one character I really liked, named Evelyn, and she starts as more of a do-gooder, but a disgraced, a former captain of this law enforcement group, and just the way she sees the world is so different from all these like badass longtime thieves and rogues, and it's just a totally different reading experience, just the vocabulary and the like. It's a more stilted kind of way of thinking and writing than in some of these other point of views. And I love when each character's idiosyncrasies show up that way. That's like Joe Abercrombie, we always think is one of the masters of the point of view in that way. So yeah, it's got great LGBT representation as well. It's not a romance. I know MJ always likes to like when people say that she doesn't want people going in thinking they're gonna be getting the full romance experience, but it does have that representation. Like I said, fans of heists, morally great characters, good dialogue, funny books, and who want to read something that isn't is in no danger of killing their pet, then this this book is a great.
You have a pet fly, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, you don't want to drop it in a fish tank. It is big enough to probably cause issues, but no mammals.
No, but then you get the pages wet too.
Yeah. It's the book that would be the real tragedy. But fans of Six of Crows, Lies of Locke, Lamora, those kind of books, and you're just going to have a great time. Like, this is one of those books that I feel very confident recommending to almost anyone. And it's she'll give the, if you're not like huge into fantasy, I think she'll say like it's Ocean's 11 meets Game of Thrones, and you throw that someone's way and a lot of people are gonna be interested. I think it totally lives up to it. So, and Thick as Thieves, the sequel's on the way. Woo! I believe this upcoming summer, unless there's been a change. So saw the cover recently there. Yeah.
Maybe we'll be talking about her again next year. You never know.
Yes. So, and I know Adrian, you probably have things to say on this one, so I'll shut up.
Dude, this one is one of my honorable mentions.
Okay.
So I'm glad you brought it up. MJ's great, just in general, and then the book, like you saying, like just such a rip roaring pace, but the kind of thing where it's like not the kind of pace that is so unforgiving where it's like you lose character development or world building or anything like that. She blends it all together so beautifully. And I love what you said about the POV, because every character feels so distinct, and you have multiple layers of betrayal and double crossing and perhaps a good girl gone bad.
Oh, unlike you, Adrian, you were just born bad.
I was just
bad to the bone.
Yes.
Yeah. But I love the ways in which the characters all interact with each other. Great dialogue, really snappy. But nothing overstays its welcome. It's like 340 pages of really tight narrative, and I can imagine for you, it's like going from a big chonker to this and just having that really like roaring pace, but having so much fun along the way. It's such a fun book. I loved it.
Listen.
Exactly. It is a great change of pace at 340 pages. And I like what you said, where she does kind of weave in the world building and the character development, rather than I just think of things like Wheel of Time that are like, there's just things that are just dedicated as chunks of the book to world building for its own sake, it feels like. And my favorite books, like, of course the world building's there, but you're finding out about it because it's relevant to the characters and the plot and what's happening at that moment. And MJ, she does it all without it feeling bloated at all, of course, but without it feeling sparse either. So it's really happy medium.
Yeah. And my next pick is a short book, not too short, sub 300. Dylan, I know you've read this as well, but Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This one, okay, so I grew up on Vancouver Island, and this book, much of it takes place on Vancouver Island, which is why I love reading St. Mandel's books, because it's like, you said books on Vancouver Island, and that makes me feel special. It also helps that she's like a, like New York Times bestseller who, Station 11 is a fantastic book, fantastic TV series as well, if anyone's got HBO. But Sea of Tranquility was it was such an appropriate, in terms of timing, meditation on all of the just utter shit that so many of us dealt with during the pandemic. You know, the book, it deals with themes of loneliness and separation and just this sort of like displacement in terms of like where you feel like you are in terms of home or in terms of family and all these different kinds of things. But it interweaves it in this sort of like crazy time travel-y kind of narrative where there are multiple different time periods all the way back to the 1800s on Vancouver Island to an author. And this felt very, very autobiographical. Yeah. An author on tour while a pandemic is breaking out. Who lives on a moon colony, and it's like, you know, but then
an
it's like
author
even farther
who wrote a book about a pandemic who's on a
exactly
like
yeah, so
11,
yeah, so it's really crazy how timely this book was. But the thing that for me was so perfect about it is, much like MJ, nothing outstayed its welcome. All of the pieces felt very coherent, and the structure, even though it took me a little while to kind of get into the structure, in the sense that it's like you have these different characters in different time periods in different planets, or not planets, but like cosmic bodies, if you want to call it that. But for me, the thing that was so poignant was the ways in which its themes were so subtle, but so powerful at the same time. And so it's dealing with all this different stuff about how these different stories interweave with each other, but the ways in which it evokes just immense feelings of, you know, sadness or distance and that kind of thing. She just pulls it off with like a single line, and it's so beautifully written. Like, Emily's prose is hands down some of the most beautiful prose in science fiction, and the ways in which she can just use, you know, a kind of like sideline bit of dialogue or like an observation to really just kind of punch you in the face with this like, holy shit moment of, this connects back to something else that was going on earlier. And, you know, the emotion that just rises to the surface in such a potent way, it just makes everything feel more evocative than it otherwise would have been. So I think the way that she uses language and the simplicity of language as well, it's not like she's like, you know, going overboard with anything, but she just uses language and really amazing concepts in terms of story structure, but also themes and places as well. You know, it's like Vancouver Island in the 1800s feels really distinct, but also the moon colony feels really distinct, but it all feels like part of the same story. And I'm just immensely impressed by how she's able to manage these different threads, and the way that it all came together was just absolutely beautiful. And so reading this kind of like, I read it in March of this year, and it's like, you know, things are seeming to come back to normal, but we've all been living through the pandemic and things were a bit surreal, I felt, where there was this uncertainty about like what is normal anymore. And this book really played with that idea of like, I have no idea what normal is.
Yeah.
And we're just as confused as you are. And so for me, it captured my attention. But after I finished the book, it lingered for a really long time. And even now, when it's like making this list of my favorite reads of the year, I was like, yeah, that's what I'm still thinking about. And I think that for me is a really powerful sign.
You did such a good
Dylan,
job.
this is one you recommended a few times on our show too.
I know. And I was just thinking while I was listening to Adrian explain it so well, I was like, this was when I was struggling to get across what makes it so great when we did like a top vacation reads recommendation episode, and this is what I recommended. And I think part of it is the way that it captures especially that Vancouver Island setting, and when it, especially at the beginning, it's kind of like beachside and stuff like that. And I I I was really struggling though to get across what makes it so awesome, and you did such a great job. I wish Charles could just take that audio of you talking about it and just replace. But I want the credit too, so it can still be like, "Hey, Dylan, can you tell us about this book?" And then it's just your voice.
Then just like splice my voice in there.
And then afterward, Charles can go, "Oh, thank you, Dylan. That was really well stated." Because, like you're saying, it was extremely timely. The autobiographical elements of it are great. The prose, though, is I don't know how to explain it. It's like super witty, and it winks kind of at the reader. I feel like it almost make fun of the characters to some extent and to the reader, but in a very subtle way. It's always in the subtext. And I don't know. Emily St. John Mandel, she writes like no one else. There's no one I can really compare her to. She tells these stories that are simultaneously like at the scale of like world ending event style stuff, right? Like a pandemic. But then she tells the most intimate, almost slice of life stories while using those huge elements. And
exactly,
she's really phenomenal. And you sent me some what you were thinking about before we record, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad that that you have that one on there. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah. And Charles, what about you? What's your next pick?
Okay, my next pick. This is a book that came out this year, I believe. This is another author that we've gotten to know through the Twitter sphere. Big fan of their work. And to me, when I think of like, because you had brought up, Adrian, you were teasing the topic of like trends in fantasy, and I was like, oh boy, my mind was kind of spinning. And this is someone that I think is kind of on the forefront of a trend in fantasy. And so I'm happy to bring him into this. I'm talking about John Gwynne, and the book that came out is The Hunger of the Gods, which is book 2 of the Bloodsword saga. Book 1 I have right here, Shadow of the Gods, came out last year. And it was a Goodreads Choice Award. It was like nominee for Best Fantasy. And honestly, it's like one of the best covers for a book I've seen in a long time. This cover is absolutely incredible. Like when I first saw it, I was like obsessed with it. I was like, wait, this cover is actually brilliant. It's like super bright, which fantasy books are always these like dark, like here's Lamora, for example, like these dark things with like weapons on them, but this is just like so bright and inviting and detailed, and
but it captures scale.
The scale, with the dragon wrapping around the back here.
Charles, show the little, I mean, just as much the little guy on there.
So it's absolutely right from before I even read a single word. I was in, and then of course the brothers Gwynne, John Gwynne's sons, are very active in the fantasy community on YouTube, and we've had the pleasure of collaborating with them on several different things. But one of the things we're able to do is have a Hunger of the Gods discussion with them, and I've been trying to supplant ideas for them to take back to John Gwynne, which we call Papa Gwynne, and just trying to get some influence over to Papa Gwynne. We'll see if we can get there. It's been a long-going thing, but the Brothers Gwynne are absolutely fantastic, and you guys should listen to them for sure. But what strikes me about this series, the Bloodsword saga, first of all, it's Norse-inspired world, and John Gwynne is like the de facto Norse mythology guy. He just lives and breathes that world. He's part of a reenactment group, a Viking reenactment group, and that really comes through in his writing. There's moments where they're forming shield walls, and a character's like fumbling with the leather strap on their helmet during a charge, and you can tell that these are things that he's definitely like lived and experienced, and like what it feels like to have someone crashing into your shield, and the practicality of wielding a certain weapon over another, and those kind of elements weave their way into this. It reminds me of Miles Cameron as well, who's another like prolific reenactor, and the details that he gets in his stories are unique in their practicalness, if that makes sense. Like so many times it's like, and then like they have a sword fight, and it's like, you know, you'd be lucky to use your sword once a year. You're mostly using it to like roast your meal over a fire or something than you are to stab someone with it.
It's an interesting juxtaposition over, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to rip on Wheel of Time one more time, just how during Robert Jordan's fight scenes, it's always like, you know, doing some fighting move, and it's called like the frog jumps the pond, and it's like, what? Like it's like, oh, he used the frog jumps the pond on his enemy. And it's like, what is that? But you get
what is that exactly?
Yeah, then John Gwynn and Miles Christian Cameron are writing these fight scenes that feel a lot more realistic, and blow by blow, but so much better. Like.
Ed McDonald is another one because he practices HEMA, like historical European martial arts.
I didn't know that, but I love his. Raven's Mark, right?
But that's definitely a trend. Authors trying to capture more of their realism in their combat, like what used to be so fantastical. And I think of like Lord of the Rings too. It's like, and this epic battle happened that could be heard across the realm, you know. But it's like, no, we want the gritty details, right? We want to know like, what is this person like fiddling with, fumbling with? What techniques are they doing? Like what's awkward in their hands? Like what feels weird? You know, what do they need more experience in? And that comes through in these books quite strong.
It's like the best circumstance of like write what you know.
Exactly.
Because it's like they really do know, but it makes for such engaging kind of approach to something like fighting, which is usually like blow by blow by blow, but it's like the little details.
It's thought-provoking too. It's still action-packed, but it's rooted in this reenactment, just also history buff of knowing how to form a shield wall and how Vikings would form shield walls back in the day. So just like all of that coming through, kind of like real life inspiring fiction here, it makes it like really pay off and in a unique way to John Gwynn's voice, right? And the other thing is, you know, we're seeing, I call it almost like a classical revival in some ways in modern fantasy, right? Where it's like, hey, we're bringing monsters back. Like we've got like dragons, and we've got little crustacean things, crab things, like all, and like these bear-like god creatures. Like we're bringing it all back.
Crabs,
and it's really they're these books, man. And like
don't go to the beach with this guy.
Yeah. This world is not a fun one.
Sex crabs and rock and roll.
He's like, he finds hermit crabs. Sorry,
I'm trying to talk about what's in this book too, and I'm not talking about hermit crabs, but we're bringing creatures back, and we're making it fun, and I think that kind of returned to like, I think Grimdark took over for a while. You had Game of Thrones, and everything that came after it was like everyone's got to be serious and miserable, and like, oh, fantasy's not as glorious as you think it is. There's all these dark costs, and everyone's kind of has PTSD, and no one's all good and no one's all bad. It's like everyone just kind of sucks a little bit the more you get to know them, and it's like that was great, But you read more and more and more of that, and you're like, okay, well, I get that everyone sucks, but can we have fun again? And like that's kind of what this book does. It's like there's some genuinely like main hero characters in this. Granted, they're not like Frodo. They still are fully rounded out, complex human beings. But it's just kind of nice to see almost this like, you know, these characters we're rooting for and things like that in this series as well. So huge fan. And also just like super epic. I would say if someone's really looking for an epic fantasy series, this is like one of those newer ones, you know, books coming out like this year that I would highly recommend. Like both of the books are pretty thick, and I think Hunger of the Gods is even bigger than this one. And it's a lot of skirmishes and characters battling each other, and really deep dive into the Norse mythology, Norse inspiration of these characters. So if you're someone that's like really looking for that unique setting and also just loves other epic fantasy series, like this is a great complement to some of those like tentpole epic fantasy series out there. It fits in with the mix super well. And the fact that it's come out this year, 2022, you get a lot of really interesting modern trends and characterization and just like what it means to be a fun, cutting edge fantasy book as well. So I figured, hey, it came out this year. We got to talk about it with the Gwynns, like fantastic, modern, epic fantasy. If any of what I've said is of any piques your interest at all, recommend checking it out for sure.
Yeah, I read The Shadow of the Gods. Really enjoyed it. Really great characterization and very awesome sort of setting. Obviously, it's like Nordic inspired, so Norway, Sweden, Finland kind of vibe to it, as well as sort of like Germanic roots in there as well. But the ways that, for me, the thing that really pulled me into it was this sort of this like looming threat of, I would say, mythology.
Yep.
And the sort of resurgence of these monsters that you brought up. Because I was like, there's so much like gritty realism to the book, but then it's like you blend it with the world building and all this mythology, and I'm like, oh, there's some like nasty shit coming.
And John Gwynn has a reputation for stabbing his readers in the heart, so that is also prevalent in these too.
Yeah.
Fantastic book.
Oh God. Yeah.
Dylan, do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, that book, Hunger especially. I don't want to get into spoilers, but there's definitely a moment or two that are tough ones. Definitely hit you really hard in the feels, and John Gwynn's not afraid. He doesn't pull his punches, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, fantastic writing. His fight scenes are so freaking good. I know everyone's saying that already, but it's like they're cinematic. I just want someone to make movies out of these books. And we've got a lot of fantasy content out there, but this one is one that really deserves to hit the screen, I think. So yeah, for all those listening who have huge connections in Hollywood, make it happen.
Make it happen, guys.
Yeah.
Go get in touch with Papa Gwynn.
We actually have been in talks with the Gwynns of trying to sneak our way onto the film set if it ever happens. So we'll see what we can do. That was another thing.
Also, we tried to talks about. Was this? Or no, this was with Christian Cameron, where he was going to train us to fight each other at some point.
Yeah, he invited us to the Adirondacks. That was a while ago. But with the Gwynns, we might be seeing them for Wimbledon.
Wait, are you actually thinking of going? I don't know.
I mean, if you're going, I would go. I'm going to ride. Wimbledon. I don't know if I would go to Wimbledon, but I would hang out in England at least.
I can't tell if Charles is serious.
Some Viking reenactments.
Yeah, I can't tell if Charles is serious about going, but
you can't meet the Gwynns without.
He doesn't like tennis.
I don't want to be left behind on the social.
Oh, he doesn't care. He's not going for the tennis.
Yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't actually go watch a tennis match.
He's going to whoop my ass in a duel.
I'm going for the Gwynns.
Exactly. I'm going to learn how to like throw up a shield wall with the Gwynns.
Yeah,
meet their goats.
I can't wait to read The Hunger of the Gods. And for anyone who's like into video games, perfect complement for this is just like the new God of War games, like God of War from 2018 and God of War Ragnarok is like such a nice sort of like Norse.
That is really well said. Like Norse mythology is on the rise. I also wouldn't sleep on The Witcher either. Like there is a lot of, I'd say, imagine The Witcher, but instead of just Geralt, there's like 3 or 4 really interesting main characters that are all living in this monster heavy world and dealing with it in their own ways. But it's that kind of same vibe of like, there's this world like freaky magic stuff is going on all around us. And we're trying to make our way through it in some ways. I'd say there's way more of a epic storyline in this with people at odds with each other than The Witcher. But I got those same vibes, it's kind of like gritty, monster laden world. So
some jaded POVs.
God of War,
but I'll say
Witcher
just grumpy, man.
I will say something I like about Shadow and Hunger of the Gods is even the characters that are jaded and have been through a lot. I think Gwyn has this willingness to be uncynical in allowing those characters to still have hope, to still care deeply about things, especially like family. Family is a huge theme in these books, and unsurprising from such a wonderful father figure to his family, and a guy who you can tell very much cherishes the family in his life. So, yeah, those kind of things where a lot of, like Charles was saying, that kind of grimdark movement was about people not just being jaded, but being jaded to the point where they just like don't value anything and have no hope. And even when the world's really tough in Gwyn's work, the characters they latch on to things that are important to them.
That's well said, Dylan. How rare is it to have like a nuclear family that all love each other and live peacefully in a fantasy world? It's like usually like parents get them out of the way right away. Our main character cannot have parents, and if they do, you have to leave them behind. It's like, no, this is like a family making it together. Like that's how this book kicks off, and it's very sweet.
Sorry, Wheel of Time. Sorry, Rand. You got to leave the two rivers, bud.
It's like, oh, he has mysterious lineage and this and that, and it's like, why can't we just have a happy family? You know, like what's wrong with that?
Yeah, it's like good friendships, good families. Come on, people.
Exactly.
All right, Dylan, what's your pick?
All right, well, let's go. You picked one that was heavily influenced by your Vancouver Island roots, and I picked one that was heavily influenced by Charles and I's Long Island roots. I picked a book called The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nhi Vo.
Cool.
And
nice.
I don't know if this one, it's a retelling of The Great Gatsby from the perspective of a side character. So Charles and I, we go way back with The Great Gatsby to our high school days, and I'm a big fan. I reread it recently, and props to Scott Fitzgerald for all that. But this takes the perspective of Jordan Baker, who's Nick, like the point of view character from The Great Gatsby. That's his love interest. So it alters a lot of aspects of Jordan as a character while kind of keeping her personality intact, but it changes character. Now she's queer and she's adopted and of Asian heritage. And it follows the main outline kind of The Great Gatsby as a story, but it adds this magic system that's based around being able to like create things and bring things to life through the paper, like scissors and folding paper and all this kind of stuff. And there's also like the ability for people to obtain demonic powers and things like that. So it's like, in The Great Gatsby, there's all these rumors about okay, where did Gatsby's money come from? All this kind of stuff. And one of the things with in The Chosen and the Beautiful is like, oh, he's made a deal with the devil. And they mean that literally. It's like a very interesting, different take. So when you read this book and you love The Great Gatsby, I think that's the way you're maybe you're most likely to appreciate it, or possibly at least like know what is likely to happen, but also be curious about, okay, what's the twist that she's going to put on this? How's this going to be different from the perspective of Jordan? And it's, it's one of those things where not a ton happens plot wise. I mean, that's not surprising because if you compare, we're talking about all these epic fantasy books that have all these world ending stakes, and that's a lot of what we read. And then you read a book that has stakes that are similar to The Great Gatsby. It's like affairs and those kind of things. It's very different, so it can feel like not a lot's happening, but her prose, I mean, somehow Vo finds a way. She like channels F. Scott Fitzgerald, who has such a, I would normally say, very unique voice, and his prose is unbelievable. And when you're reading it, it just feels like you're reading Fitzgerald. And I don't know how she does it, but the sentence structure, the vocabulary, and it makes it such a pleasure to just sit and read, even when not a ton is happening there. So
Yeah.
it's a book that yeah, I see it around a lot in bookstores. Like if I'm in the airport, like I've seen times where there's just stacks of it. So obviously it's getting out there in some way, but I feel like I don't
Mhm.
hear enough people talking about it. And I'm not sure why. So I wanted to give the chance to highlight it here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, me, I've read her um I think it's just a novella called The Empress of Salt and Fortune.
I've heard of that one. Yeah.
And it's really, really cool, kind of like Southeast Asian inspired fantasy, but told in a very cool way, sort of like through flashbacks and stuff. But the prose is beautiful, but it's really interesting for me to kind of like put in my head like, okay, she wrote these very, very fantasy novels and she has a strong presence in terms of her writing style. But to translate that to something like The Great Gatsby and F. Scott Fitzgerald as well, there's a new book that came out this year of hers called Siren Queen,
Mm.
which is sort of like the silent era movies,
Huh.
but from the perspective of an Asian woman in that world, getting like typecast in films and
Mm.
stuff like that, but also that there's a magic system in this kind of similar stuff to what you're talking about with this, you know, people in positions of power, with, you know, making deals with, some shady forces and things like that. So it's kind of cool that she's exploring, not only fantasy worlds but also the real world and real history, sort of in this way where it's like recontextualizing for modern audiences.
Definitely. And you don't get a lot, we're so used to this medieval epic fantasy stuff. You don't get a lot of Long Island fantasy. And
Mhm.
we need more of it.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, but it's very much a unique novel. I think that I'd be very curious if someone read this who hasn't read The Great Gatsby, what
Yeah,
they'd think of it. Because for me, the whole lens of it was knowing what happens in Gatsby and seeing, okay,
exactly.
she's going this way and being able to appreciate the way that she's able to make it. It's like her main character, Jordan, has a voice that feels like the character Jordan when she is in The Great
Mm,
Gatsby. But yeah, it has that sort of specificity to it while also having the more general, just writing style and prose that Fitzgerald has. It's kind of like flowy, uh, almost a little, I say this with love, peace and love to F. Scott Fitzgerald. A little pretentious the way that he
yeah.
writes, but it's beautiful and he'll capture things in a way that it's like something you're aware of, but you've never thought to phrase it that way, or if you've never really considered it from
Mhm.
that angle. And Vo is able to do the same thing. And I think the proposition of taking a beloved classic like The Great Gatsby and doing your own thing with it was, I guess, high risk, high
Bold.
reward, and totally paid off.
Mhm. Yeah, but it's also kind of cool to see like, let's have a conversation in the form of like a book conversing with a book
Yeah,
over the course of like almost 100 years, you know?
yeah,
Because I think Gatsby came out in like the
the
mid
20s.
1920s.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's kind of like 100 years later. Let's have this sort of like creative dialogue
yeah.
between past and present.
Yeah, definitely modernizes it in terms of the themes. I mean, it does play a role that she's adopted and that she's of Asian heritage and she's in this kind of like high class, very white society in on the
Hmm.
North Shore of Long Island, and like people kind of treat her as, for lack of a better word, they treat her as like a spectacle. Like, well, she's also kind of accepted into the world in some ways.
Right.
She's very clearly different than everyone else who's there, and the way she gets tokenized at points, like
Yeah.
those kind of themes, they're very modern, but you're putting it in this very real feeling 1920s like time period.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, it's really interesting.
Good pick though. I like that.
Thank you.
We're gonna do some honorable mentions. So let us know now or lose your opportunity forever. But I'm just gonna list off a few that I really enjoyed. I'm not gonna get into any detail, but I just want to give them a shout out. I finished the original Mistborn trilogy with the Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, and that was just epic.
Very few do a conclusion like Sanderson and the Mistborn especially. I feel like the way he ties everything together, that is so satisfying.
Yeah, and I read that one while on vacation in Italy during my brief hiatus during the summer. So that was really fantastic. Another is, I already mentioned, Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn was one of mine. Stars and Bones by Gareth L. Powell. Also just really fantastic space opera. And Gareth has a very, very approachable writing style. And he does characterization incredibly well. So I highly recommend Stars and Bones. And that's kind of like in the same ballpark as Eyes of the Void and Shards of Earth. And then another one this is kind of like a two-hitter. They're both novellas, but A Psalm for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers.
Oh, nice.
Both quite short books, like, less than 200 pages each. But really like cozy, very optimistic science fiction set in a very interesting world where there's a very strong dialogue between nature and technology, robots and humans. And I really, really love that one. Charles, do you have any honorable mentions?
Oh boy, let's see. Yes, I do. For sure, wanted to make sure we talk about Joe Abercrombie. When we came back, being able to actually get to the last two books of the Age of Madness. It was so funny because we were given arcs of the Wisdom of Crowds in a preparation for our interview with Joe. So we had read them, and that was just a cool experience, being able to like have that book in my hands before the release day, after Dylan and I have been talking about the world of the First Law universe for like a decade.
Yeah.
So to have that final book in our hands as an arc felt like a crazy moment for us. But we didn't actually get to talk about it until we came back this year. And we talked about The Trouble with Peace and The Wisdom of Crowds. The Trouble with Peace, in my opinion, is like it's like a perfect fantasy novel. It's like so good. It's Abercrombie's best work for sure. And then The Wisdom of Crowds is like the gravy on, like, the cherry on top. Is just like absolutely incredible how he just takes the plot structure of a trilogy and totally goes off the rails with it, but never stops being entertaining, never stops being funny. So huge fan. Let's see, what else did we read? We got to read Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. We had read those books a long time ago, and to come back and revisit them is like super fascinating. I forgot how dark and intense those books were. Like I always knew that they were. But then after reading a bunch of fantasy books in a row and going back to that one, I was like, wow, Mark Lawrence was not pulling any punches on that one. So we read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which was an awesome short story. I'll leave a couple for Dylan to suggest here. But we also read, for the first time, we were reading the Stormlight Archives. We're about 3 books into that. I don't think that really needs much of a recommendation other than it's my first time reading it, so I'm super excited to get into it. It's a huge
one of those up-and-coming authors, small series. He did this Kickstarter. He only made millions.
Like a $5,000 Kickstarter.
It's like, so, we just wanted to give him a little pop.
Yeah, let's give him a little bit of a shout out. Try and boost him a little bit there. But super happy to be
What's
reading
his name?
those
Like Sandon Branderson or something?
Brando Sando, something like that.
Yeah.
No, Adrian said it.
So it's been a really, like, we've been reading a lot of classics and a lot of new stuff. We've been kind of going back and forth on our reading schedule, and we've read a lot of really good stuff this year, and it's been a really good time to be in the world of SFF fiction out there. And so those are just some of mine. I know Dylan will kind of pick up where I left off here on our reading.
Yeah, go for it, buddy.
And most of what Charles just mentioned would probably be on mine as well, but definitely, shout out to Joe Abercrombie. I feel bad if I don't say anything by his, but I really want to say Jade City by Fonda Lee. That was our first time reading Fondeli's work, and
she's so good, man.
she is incredible, and another one of those that is a breath of fresh air with this Asian inspired setting, more of an urban fantasy, following the beats of this mafia style film. And Fondely is another author like John Gwynne that doesn't pull any punches, and she'll hit you in the feels pretty hard. He's interesting.
Dude,
yeah.
Wait till you guys read books 2 and 3.
That's what everyone says.
Locklands made me cry this year. Fonda, you fucking broke my heart last year. Yeah, she's been on the show a bunch of times. And she is just wonderful. She's like the nicest person, but then I'm like, you're ruthless on the page. Like,
it's funny. Yeah, it's funny how that works sometimes. Yeah. I mean, that's what everyone says about this book. It's funny you say it too. It's like whenever we bring this up on social media in any way, they're like, oh, like you have to read the whole series. Like, read it now. And, Charles is like, has his face in. That's good. Charles is just trying to keep. He's trying to read Oathbringer while not like dropping it on his poor puppy. So we'll get to reading the rest for sure. But I do hear the rest of the series is incredible, and we're super excited. Let's also say Project Hail Mary. And that's another one
by Andy Weir.
Real up and comer. You probably haven't heard of him. He had this other book called The Martian,
The Venetian, or something.
It's they made this very small indie film out of it. It's no, I mean,
this like relatively obscure actor Matt Damon.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of him before, but he puts in a great performance. Obviously Andy Weir is huge, and he doesn't need me to give him any more pop, but I'm going to anyway because it's an incredible book, and that's one that I recommend the audiobook for, and I can't say why without spoiling, but I feel strongly about the audiobook on that one. And I also want to say the first 15 lives of Harry August was one that was a little outside my. Have you read that
by Claire North?
Yeah, Claire North.
Yeah. Claire's awesome. Yeah.
No, that was a really interesting new take on one of those time travel books, and just the way it felt very true to how if someone was able to just relive their life over and over and over again, just the way that warps their perspective on the value of human life, those kind of things. It felt very true. It's actually something I think Joe, I don't know if this was when he was talking to us or at some other point, but Joe talked about how like a wizard like Gandalf that's just like watching generations and generations by. Joe's like, I don't feel like you would be so loving of everyone if that were so I think
just warp your sanity.
Oh, totally, right? It's like so in that one, when you die, you just basically wake up back at the beginning of your life over again, and you get to kind of like replay it. And
it's like New Game Plus kind of.
Yeah, exactly. With the knowledge that you had from the previous lives. And it's like, if someone dies, you're like, oh, well, I'll catch him next time around. It's like, but obviously for the people who aren't like that, that's their one and only chance. It's their only life. So it's, great character writing, and just a totally different use of that trope that I hadn't really encountered in that way before. So, one more. I'll just say The First Binding by R.R. Verde, which is an interesting one. Nice. That's another new one, and that's why I'm highlighting it. It's interesting for the Kingkiller Chronicle fans out there. It is it's probably more similar to the Kingkiller Chronicle than The Chosen and the Beautiful is to The Great Gatsby, and that one's an actual retelling. Couldn't help myself, but no, it is a lot like the Kingkiller Chronicle, and there's a lot of positives to say about that. It means that there's great prose. There's also really interesting main character who's telling his story and has accomplished all these epic deeds. And I am highlighting it as an honorable mention because it's really good. It's it is the kind of thing though where it's so similar to Kingkiller Chronicle that kind of started to take me out of the story a little bit at times. So if you're a big
but
Chronicle,
it's been long enough though since I've read the Name of the Wind that I'm like, I don't really think it would be that, because I haven't read it yet, but Ronnie is awesome. I've interacted with him on Twitter and he's fantastic. But it's like it's been so long that I feel like but I feel like it could be kind of like a really awesome like love letter combined with something really fresh and unique to him.
Yeah. I mean, he's acknowledged it that there's a lot of inspiration from the Kingkiller Chronicle, and he has a very clear, I guess, Easter egg sort of thing that's referencing the Kingkiller Chronicle. So it doesn't feel like he's unaware of those kind of things. So I think it's a great recommendation for fans of the Kingkiller Chronicle and the Name of the Wind, especially. But you have to be willing to acknowledge that it's going to have some similarities. And if that's going to annoy you, then that's not going to be the best book for you. But I mean, hopefully this one actually gets done in a reasonable amount of time. You know, we want Rothfuss to take all the time he needs, but those of us that are huge Kingkiller fans are chomping at the bit over here. So this can fill that Kingkiller sized hole in your heart.
Oh, that's a nice note to wind things down on. Just to finish off, I wanted to know what's on your what's immediately next on your TBRs. I'll share mine. So we've got TBR Con coming up in late January. We'll be doing a bunch of announcements in December and January. But I am going to do a few panels for TBR Con, and one of those is going to be on space opera. And I've been meaning to get to this forever. But Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce his name. Rocchio or Rocchio?
I don't know.
But it's part of a series called Sun Eater. But I'm really excited because people have been recommending it to me as this combination of like Dune, like a modern Dune, but like mixed with really big elements of like epic fantasy. So I'm super into that, and I'm really excited to read that before TBR Con. But Charles, what about you? What's coming up on your TBR?
Great question. Well, we recently, shared on social media that we were given these beautiful copies of The Kingdom of Liars by Nick Martell. So depending on when this episode airs, we may or may not have dived into this bad boy already. So super excited to get more into this. And speaking of Long Island, the author, Nick Martell, is a fellow Huntington boy, just like us. So
not
very
Huntington,
excited.
I don't think.
No, he's not from Huntington? I thought he was.
North Shore. I think he is North Shore.
Are you sure?
Look it up, but
Huntington, New York. Too. He moved to Huntington, New York. Yes, sweet. Think I'm crazy?
Oh, yeah. I just thought I'd remember it. If it was
unless he's lying in his bio, read the author bio, man. That'd be an odd
Kingdom
lie.
of Liars. You're gonna just believe everything in there.
So very excited about that one.
Nice.
Let's see, Dylan, what else do we have coming up? We're reading through Stormlight Archive, so super excited to kind of catch up on that. We're on Oathbringer right now.
Yes,
that's the one we're like.
Then you got
Rhythm of War.
Rhythm of War on the horizon.
Before too long.
Let's see. We're gonna do a friends pitching fantasy very soon. So we're gonna have to come up with a couple different ideas. There's so many that I want to like revisit, and some I want to read for the first time. So I'm kind of have a bunch of books swirling around in my head, but those are the ones that we've got coming up real soon that I'm excited about.
Nice. Dylan, what about you?
Yeah, those also, because Charles and I, our TBRs end up relatively similar because of the show. But I have a few others in the mix. There's one that I just picked up kind of on a whim in a bookstore that I'm probably going to read soon called Lost in Time by A.G. Riddle. And
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, I basically just saw the cover. The cover is really cool. It's like got all these sort of pinks and purples to it, and the silhouette of a person falling. And it's one of those where you grab it because the cover looks cool, and then you start going on Goodreads or whatever and looking it up because, God forbid you actually just grab a book and buy it. I have to know all the ratings and stuff. And then it's actually nominated for those Goodreads choice for sci-fi. And I was like, oh, wow, that's awesome. And it's got a 4.31. I'm like, wow, this is exciting. So it's a standalone novel that is basically about, like, they'll send people back in time when they're found guilty of a crime. And they're sending this guy who's falsely accused of murder back 200 million years into the past. And there's like, he's basically there with like dinosaurs and crap. So I was like, this is a really cool idea. So that one's coming up. I mean, I definitely, once the summer hits and Thick as Thieves comes out, that's in the mix. I want to keep going with
Battle Drum, another highly anticipated release.
Of course. I want to keep going with the Greenbone Legacy. So those are going to be coming up soon. And I assume by the time this airs, we'll have a release date for The Doors of Stone. So that as well.
Yeah, in like the next 2 weeks.
Next 3 of the King Killer Chronicle.
A Christmas miracle.
Yeah. So so fingers crossed on that release date. That's what's coming.
That's a bold claim, buddy, but we'll see. Just go read Ronnie's book. Go read the first binding.
Yeah. I'm going to read the first binding again.
The second binding will be out before The Doors of Stone. I'm sure.
Is it going to be called the second binding?
I don't think so. I don't know.
That's amazing.
Oh, man. Awesome. Well, Dylan and Charles, thank you guys so much for indulging in your favorite reads of the year with me. Can you let viewers and listeners know where they can find you on social media and where they can listen to Friends Talking Fantasy?
Absolutely. Do you know, Adrian, approximately when this episode's going to air?
This will be out in December 13th, I believe.
That's very specific.
That's plenty of time for The Doors of Stone. 11
days, Rothfuss. Bring it.
Plenty of time, considering all the time that we've had up to this point. But yeah, so we're the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. You can find us pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts, all the major ones anyway. We're on Instagram at the FTF Podcast and Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end. Couldn't get that regular one, but we're trying. By the time this airs, we've got some exciting stuff coming up. I will tease that before the end of the year, we're going to hit our 200th episode, and you guys are not going to want to miss what we've got planned for that. And, it's the other bunch of fun end of the year stuff, but that's where you can find us, right, Dylan?
That is exactly where you can find us. Yeah, wherever you listen to podcasts.
All tweets by Dylan Marsh.
Yes.
Dylan's doing some great work over there.
Any you don't like was actually Charles. Yeah. All the good ones.
And now that Charles has read Lies of Locke Lamora, you can just give Dylan shit about reading the rest of the Greenbone saga, or both of them.
The problem is he hasn't read that one.
I did give him crap about not reading the Hobbit, but he immediately then read it.
You see, that's the thing. You can just read books when people recommend them to you. So, that was The Hobbit. That's a short one too.
That was one you read this year.
That true.
Didn't make your list, though.
It did not make my list.
Damn.
And I'm sorry to all those big Tolkien heads out there.
Whatever, you got Rings of Power, that little crap fest.
You Tolkien heads are just fine. Is that a bad boy? Oh my goodness.
Wow, yeah, the bad boy takes a shot at Rings of Power. I mean, it's the honorable mention House of the Dragon, though.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I enjoyed House of the Dragon, and I got to review it with Miltos Yorolomu and MJ Kuhn and Liam Quinn. Miltos was Serial Pharrell on Game of Thrones, so that was really cool to hang out with him. So, yeah. It's just like random coincidence that we managed to like get in touch.
What did he say to the God of Death?
Listen to find out.
Said, we're not going to tell you today.
No. Go listen to our TV club, House of the Dragon.
Listen to that. I can't believe I missed that. I gotta go check that out. That's amazing.
I'll send the link to you guys, and I'll link to it.
Definitely drop that link, man. Anyone that's
is Serial alive? Did you ask?
Ask George R. R. Martin's wife. Oh, she knows.
Oh, I'm not really in touch with her.
Is she on Instagram? Like what?
Yeah. You can slide into those DMs still.
Just like, we're just hanging out.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. Leave that to the bad boy of the SFF community.
Yeah, man. Good boys don't get shit.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. It was an absolute pleasure hanging out with you. And thank you so much for taking the time and chatting books with me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.